one of my most pleasant memories growing up was a evening spent at the dinner table with my father, who was reading to me and showing to me in books the story of the Maginot Line. Now, I'm not going to tell you the story of the Maginot Line. If you don't know it, you can look it up yourself. But at the end of the day, it's a memory that sticks with me because it's a turning point in my life. My father sitting there with those books, happened to be the Encyclopedia Britannica, as I recall, and we were reading about World War II and the Maginot Line, and it was really my first introduction to actually studying history with my father sitting at that table. And it's something that I've carried with me literally my entire life. It's almost like that was a defining moment for me and something that I remember very, very well. This past week has been interesting because after Dad passed and after the funeral and everything, I found myself eager to get back to doing what I do, but there was just something. If I was a writer, I would call it writer's block, but it wasn't writer's block. I was having a hard time making this work. It's hard to explain. When it comes to podcasting is more hermeneutics than it is in radio. Hermeneutics is it's a term that we use a lot in theology. What it means is someone who, it means the art of the practice of interpretation of a text, whether that's, we apply it particularly to scriptural texts, but it applies to literature as well. And I like to think it applies to history. When it comes to, like I said, podcasting, there's more hermeneutics than there is in radio. And radio, I'm not going to say radio is easy. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm not even implying that. What I'm saying is it's different because in radio, you have what's called topic A, and that's the topic. If you happen to be listening to this the day I record it, September 16th, 2022, you know that topic A is illegal immigrants in Martha's Vineyard. Now, I don't need to interpret that for you. I have an opinion about it. You have an opinion about it. Over the course of an hour-long radio show or a 3-hour radio show, there will be callers. In my case, it would have been texters and emailers, all of whom have opinions about it. We're not trying to interpret it. We're trying to find some applicability to it. We're trying to find what outrages us about it or what's funny about it or whatever. Podcasting is different for me, at least in a way. Number one, it's usually solo. There's no callers. There's no guests. Occasionally you have a co-host, but so it requires a much tighter presentation of things. And it's not enough to just have an opinion about it. There's no immediate pushback. There's no caller. There's no disagreement or agreement. And downstream, there'll be some texts or some comments or whatever. But podcasters tend to engage more in hermeneutics. That is the interpretation of what it is that they're talking about. That branch of knowledge, as I said, that deals with interpretation, especially of scriptural and literary type texts. Because of that, I found myself stuck because I was trying to get that Brutus thing done yesterday. I was ready to do it a week ago, but I just couldn't get that interpretive idea that I needed to make it work. And it was driving me up a wall. And I finally sat down and I said, what do I got to do to get this done? And I did what I've done 40 years, I guess, since I learned to read. So probably longer than that, 50 years. I grabbed a book off the shelf and I just went and sat on the comfortable couch in the den and I just started reading. I didn't even try to find anything that was relatively related to what I was talking about. I just started reading. And then that caused me to go get another book. I was reading that book. And eventually, what always gets me back on track is reading, finding a book, sitting down with that book and reading it. And it's something that I've done my whole life. And it's something that it doesn't even have to be something new. It can be something I've read hundreds of times. In fact, the way I tend to read books, especially history books, is I find the relevant section. For example, over there on my shelf, I have Will Durant's History of Civilization. It's 11 volumes. Most of them are in that 1,000-page area, each volume. But if I'm interested in, say, Greek democracy at one point, which has occupied a lot of my time lately, I'll just read that section. I won't read the whole book, and I'll read it. And eventually I work my way through the whole thing because my interest changes, from day to day. Fiction, I tend to read cover to cover, but history I read with whatever's relevant to me at that time. So at any rate, I was stuck, didn't know what to do, didn't know how to hermeneutically pull that podcast together. What's the interpretive idea? What's the mission of what we're talking about here? And so I was frustrated with it, but I went and read, and that book that I happened to read got me back on track. And I made a post on that. Now, for those of you who don't keep up with what's going on here, I got booted off Facebook back in August, in the middle of or July, I guess, in the middle of my visit to my dad, my last visit with him. I managed to get myself booted off Facebook, and I didn't get a 30-day jail sentence. I got executed. Well, like most intelligent people, I had a backup account, so I shifted to that, but it meant literally starting over and everything was gone. But I posted it on that, which I use a different system for posting now. Now I have my own website, my own personal website called Dave Book, all the Dave, none of the Facebook. And then I post from that to my new Facebook account, which makes people go to that. At any rate, I had posted on there about how happy I was that I'd gotten back on track by reading, and I found a diagram of a fellow sitting at what appears to be a gas station, but it's a library like the one behind me. And the library has this pump hose that's plugged into him, and he's reading, and it's reinvigorating him. So I posted that, and I got a tweet response about, well, what books did you read? What's interesting you right now? What's got your fascination, Dave? Boy, that's a long question. I get the same question on a fairly regular basis when I do Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live. I get that, where are you getting all this? Where do you read all this stuff? And so I had literally to put together the beginnings of a bibliography for that, which is on the website, plausiblylive.com, just goes to the Dave Does History part. But look, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I read history, but I don't limit myself to Wikipedia and Britannica. I have a long list of books that I read on a pretty regular basis in the past few weeks, particularly with trying to get my mind around Brutus and his understanding of things. I've spent a lot of time in ancient Greco-Roman history because this is the birth of the Republican ideal, the birth of democracy, and it's been fascinating. And I have spent time in Livy and Plato and Plutarch, but where I've really spent my time, and I've spent quite a bit of money, is on some original histories. So Herodotus, who is considered by most scholars to be the first historian. Now, you could argue that it was Homer, but his epic poetry, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are more literature than they are history. It's Herodotus who finally actually lays out the history of what went on in those stories, and it's considered to be the first history, and it's fascinating stuff. Of course, along with him comes Thucydides, who is the first really grumpy historian, a guy who is writing his history because he doesn't want things to be forgotten. And along with him, then you've got Xenophon. You can't study Greek history, ancient history, without going through Xenophon, from which our word xenophobic comes. But that was the guy's name, Xenophon, and his Anabasis is his story about how he served as a mercenary and marched, halfway across the known world, lost the battle, turned around and left, came home. It's a fascinating story. Of course, the campaigns of Alexander the Great, it's remarkable to me how much of our modern history can be traced back to the actions of Alexander the Great. And just for good measure, Julius Caesar, the landmark, or the campaigns of Julius Caesar, who fascinates me from a Republican standpoint because here's the man who essentially destroyed the Republic. But at the same time, for some reason, we think of him as a hero. I'm not absolutely clear why. And every portrayal of Julius Caesar in the media, in the movies and stuff, it tends to be very sympathetic. And yet he's the man who literally destroyed the Republic. It's weird to me. When you're reading history, you eventually come to understand that there are literally 4 reasons why people write history. This isn't absolute, but it is hard not to see it in these terms when you think about it. The first reason people write history is to entertain other people. We're going to tell you these stories, these past things, and we're going to do it in a way that, well, entertains people, and they love that. The second reason, of course, is education, and sometimes these reasons, by the way, overlap quite a bit. You can be entertaining while be educational. But maybe they wrote the history simply to educate people about certain ideas and certain principles that they wanted to make sure got passed down. The third reason, of course, is analysis. This is where you're getting into why this happened, not just what happened, not just learn this great story, but really why did it happen? Thucydides is big on this. He is really trying to analyze why the things that happened in his era happened. And more importantly, of course, he wants to educate people so that in this analysis, they will learn not to do those same things again. But I think the biggest reason why history gets written, certainly this is Herodotus in his writings, is simply to celebrate accomplishments, to celebrate things that are amazing in a way that we don't always think about, or that we want to think about the way our history is written. And you'll begin to see that much of it is written as celebratory. Much of it is written to praise and to be excited about things that are happening. And it's important. It's very important to do that. But it's also critical to understand that tyrants tend to rewrite history to do away with celebration. That's the one thing they can't have. Because when people celebrate something, they begin to revere it. They begin to cling to that, as it were. And so by getting rid of celebratory history, you tend to erase history in a way that causes people to forget it. I was stunned when I realized this, when I came across this concept a couple of weeks ago, because this idea of erasing celebratory history is really at the root of why people are erasing history today, why people are tearing down statues. It doesn't have anything to do with political correctness. It doesn't have anything to do with wokeism. It has to do with getting rid of, celebratory history that celebrates something, because that is history that causes problems to get going. We could spend a lot of other time talking about, the choices of history and things like that. But when you look at history writing, particularly, and you try to gather it into one of those 4 things. What am I reading here? Am I reading celebration? Am I reading entertainment? Am I reading education? Am I reading analysis? That can change how you read that history. That can change how you understand what's on the page. Because remember, every history writer makes a choice about what to contain in that history. They can't possibly contain everything. It's not possible to do that. So they make a conscious choice. These are the facts, the ideas, the analysis, the entertainment, the celebration that I'm going to include. That doesn't mean it's the entirety of it, but it does help us to focus on why they say the things that they're saying or write the things they're doing. So what is it that I sat down and read? The reply on the tweet wanted to know this question. What is it that you sat down and read that got you back on track? Well, quite simply, it was one of the books that's been in my library for the longest time. I've had this book for, probably close to 30 years. I didn't really start reading it until about 20 years ago. It is one of the best books I've ever read. I mean, simply put, David Hackett Fischer's Liberty and Freedom is simply one of the best books I've ever read. It is a book that every person interested in the ideas of America should have on your shelf, and you should read. If you go to a used bookstore, it's probably about 60 to 70% that they have a copy of this. You can get it online. You can get it at Amazon. Believe me, it is worth every penny that you will pay for it and more. This is a book that will change how you see America. It will change how you see the concepts of liberty and freedom, which we've talked about yesterday. It is history that touches all four of the reasons: celebration, entertainment, education, and of course, analysis. It is history that is highly readable. It's not mired in technical language and details that have you banging your head against the table. I was talking to Bill the other day about, the reason he didn't like history in high school is because it was just names and dates. This isn't that. This gets into the choices that most historians won't touch and why those things are in there. This book, Liberty and Freedom, is absolutely the best book you could possibly buy. And I don't say that lightly. I generally don't recommend things, willy-nilly. But I'm telling you, if you have any interest in American history and understanding American democratic ideals, you have to have David Hackett Fischer's Liberty and Freedom. There's nothing better. I mean, it's just really that good of a book. It's really, it's altering. I mean, it will change how you see things. And that's, of course, what you're looking for in the big scheme of things. I'm a book person. My favorite places on the world are libraries, even though I don't have a library card, and I don't want a library card, and I'll tell you why. I just don't like the idea of having to give it back. So if I find a book that I want, I go get it, because since I was a youngster, one of my favorite memories of my dad and my mother, who's still living, I don't think in my entire youth that I ever asked for a book that I didn't get, or if I asked for money for a book, they found a way to get it to me. It was something that I still think about, because while the four reasons are equally important, I have a seventh grader now who I'm responsible for. And when he asks for a book, I think back to my parents and I say, if he wants a book, it's because there's knowledge in that book, and it's because he wants to read it. The Rebbe teaches this. It's one of his teachings that he talks about why you should have books in your house, full of books. It says a home that is full of books means the home that is defined by its books, a home where books fill the entire essence of the home. Now, in fairness, he is talking about, primarily books about Torah and Talmud and the likes of that. One of the things he says in that teaching is that just having those books present is important, because at some point, a child, a youngster might pull the book off the shelf and begin to read, and new vistas will open. I was sitting in the den library just yesterday, and I said to Ben, do you ever just skim through these books? Do you ever read these books? And he's like, yeah, all the time. It's like, wow. I didn't know he did that. I didn't know that he went in there and just pulled books off the shelf and started looking at them. I'm glad he does. He even said to me, Dad, do you remember last year I had to do a project about X? And we came in here and got that book. And we went through that book and we started to do that. Just like my dad sat at that kitchen table in Pueblo, Colorado with me in 1978 and went through the story of the Maginot Line. They say that a reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. I've fought at Troy. I've marched through Greece with Xenophon. I've stood against Persia. I've conquered the world. I've conquered Gaul. And I know that through those 1,000 lives, history to me has come alive. It has educated me. It has entertained me. It has caused me to think. And it has caused me to celebrate things throughout my life and throughout the history that I'm involved with. Just like my father did for me, and as I hope to do for you and for my son Ben, I read because reading gets me back on track. It opens up what I'm trying to do. And most importantly, it gives me ideas. And those ideas then become the things that I talk about, the things that I will share, not just with you, not just as my dad did with me, but with my son and with everyone I meet. So I hope that answers your question, texter, tweeter. I hope that tells you what I was doing and why I was doing it. Most importantly, what I was reading.